There are moments in life that make you stop and rethink everything you thought you knew. For James Kessler, a billionaire's son, that moment came when he found a homeless man lying on the steps of his luxurious estate. At first he was frustrated and annoyed. How dare someone disrupt his peaceful world of privilege? But what James learned from this man would shatter everything he thought he understood about life, success, and happiness. What was the homeless man's story, and how did it change James's life forever? Stay tuned to find out. It's a lesson you won't forget. James Kessler was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. At 27, he had everything most people dreamed of: money, power, a sprawling mansion in the heart of Beverly Hills, and an endless supply of luxury cars. His father, Marcus Kessler, was one of the wealthiest men in the country, the founder of a multi-billion-dollar tech company that revolutionized the industry. James's life was a perfect picture of success, or so it seemed. On the surface, he had it all: the house, the vacations, the status. Yet something always felt empty. James had never known true struggle. His problems were always about which designer suit to wear or which private jet to take on his next trip. He had a small circle of friends, people who shared his interests, wealth, status, and ambition. But beyond that, his life was devoid of real meaning. He was, in a way, a prisoner of his own privilege. One crisp morning, James was walking to his car after a quick breakfast in his estate's sprawling kitchen. The sun had just risen, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns, the perfect start to another perfect day. As he walked to his black Porsche parked at the front of the house, something caught his eye. There, slumped on the steps of his front porch, was a man. His clothes were tattered, his beard unkempt, and his face was weathered from years of exposure to the elements. A cardboard sign lay next to him, though it was too far away for James to read. The sight of the homeless man caused James's heart to race, not out of sympathy, but irritation. This was his private space. No one had the right to disturb it. His first instinct was to call security, to have the man removed, but he hesitated. Something about the scene felt different. The homeless man wasn't aggressive or loud. He wasn't causing trouble. He was simply there, as if he had nowhere else to go. James stood there, unsure of what to do. His life had been so controlled, so predictable, that this uninvited disruption felt like an intrusion. As he watched the man sleep, James thought about his own life. He had everything he could ever need: his father's wealth, the best education money could buy, and endless opportunities. Yet, despite all of it, something was missing. He had never truly struggled for anything. Everything had been handed to him, and it had made him complacent. His curiosity started to grow. Who was this man? What was his story? How did someone end up sleeping on the steps of a mansion like his? And more importantly, how did he feel about it? He couldn't shake the image of the man's tired, worn face. James wanted to know what brought him here, and more importantly, what that might teach him about his own life. James walked closer to the man, still unsure of what to do. His feet hesitated with each step, his gaze never leaving the stranger. The homeless man looked so still, almost peaceful, as if he had made peace with the harshness of the world. James couldn't understand how anyone could be comfortable in such a situation. The warmth of the sun began to increase, and the man shifted slightly, waking up to the sound of footsteps. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The homeless man, groggy from sleep, looked at James with weary eyes, almost as though he didn't recognize where he was. Slowly, he rose to a sitting position, pulling his knees to his chest and wrapping his arms around them as if to shield himself from the world. "Hey, are you okay?" James asked, his tone coming out a little more frustrated than he intended. He didn't know how to approach someone like this. Should he offer help, or just kick him off the property? The man didn't respond immediately. His clothes were old and ragged, his shoes practically falling apart. He wore a thick layer of grime, but beneath it, James could see a glimmer of strength in his eyes. There was something dignified about the way he held himself, despite his situation. After a long silence, the man finally spoke, his voice raspy but calm. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, sir," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I just needed a place to rest for a while." The man's apology struck James in a way he hadn't expected. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a simple acceptance of his own reality. For a brief moment, James felt a sense of discomfort wash over him, as though the man's presence was forcing him to confront something he'd been avoiding for years, his own privilege. "You don't belong here," James blurted out, instantly regretting it the moment the words left his mouth. The homeless man nodded, unfazed by the comment. "I know," he said softly, "but it's not always about where you are. Sometimes it's about just being." James didn't know how to respond. The man's words lingered in the air, reverberating in his mind. What did he mean? What did it mean to just be, to exist, without fighting for status or success? "I'm sorry," James said, swallowing his discomfort. "I don't know why I said that." The homeless man looked at him again, the same tired eyes studying James as if trying to figure him out. "It's all right," he replied. "You don't have to understand everything." And just like that, James felt the world shift beneath his feet. This man, with nothing, was teaching him something profound, something he couldn't explain but knew was important. "I'm Robert, by the way," the man said, as though the introduction might make this encounter a little more comfortable for both of them. "What's your name?" "James," he replied. "James Kessler." The name didn't seem to register with Robert. Maybe he had heard of the Kesslers, or maybe he hadn't. James couldn't tell, but the lack of recognition was strangely liberating. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire's son or a privileged heir. He was just James, standing face to face with a man who had nothing but his name. The conversation continued in awkward fits and starts. James, who was used to controlling every interaction, found himself unable to predict Robert's responses or the direction the conversation would take. He tried asking questions, hoping to understand more about Robert's life, but every question seemed to reveal just how little he truly knew about the world beyond his wealthy bubble. Robert, it turned out, had been homeless for several years. His story was one of hardship and loss. Years of poor decisions, addiction, and the ultimate abandonment of those who were supposed to help him. Robert had lost his family, his job, and his sense of purpose. But in some strange way, he seemed at peace with it all. He didn't blame anyone, and he didn't ask for pity. He simply existed, living day by day, trying to find small moments of joy where he could. "I used to think the world was all about what you could get," Robert said as they sat together, the sun now fully shining. "I thought that the more you had, the more important you became. But I learned that's not true. It's about what you can give, what you can offer to others." James stared at him, unsure of what to say. Robert's words echoed in his mind, but they didn't make sense. How could it be about giving when Robert had so little? James didn't understand. He had spent his whole life accumulating things, cars, houses, clothes, and had always been told that success was about getting ahead. But Robert's words were shaking that foundation. "I've seen how the world treats people like me," Robert continued, his voice quiet now, almost reflective. "People look at you like you're invisible, like you don't matter. They assume you're just a failure, someone to ignore." James felt an uncomfortable twinge in his chest. Was that how he had been treating Robert? Was he just another person to ignore, another failure to write off? "I used to think like that too," James admitted, surprising himself. "I used to think people like you were just in the way." Robert didn't react to the comment, but James noticed the flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was as if he had known that all along. It was clear that Robert had seen people like James come and go, making snap judgments about him and others without ever truly understanding their lives. That evening, after their conversation, James found himself unable to sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had always lived in a world of comforts where everything was within reach, but meeting Robert, spending even just a few hours with him, had shifted something deep inside him. James realized that he had never truly understood the struggles of others. He had never had to fight for a roof over his head, for food, for dignity. And yet Robert, with all his hardship, was still able to offer kindness, wisdom, and a perspective on life that James could never have imagined. It made James question everything. Was he really happy with the life he had? Or was he just going through the motions, living in a gilded cage of his own making? The next day, James decided to take action. He couldn't just let this moment pass without doing something about it. He knew Robert was still out there, somewhere in the city, and he knew he couldn't just forget about him. James went on to meet Robert several more times over the course of the next few weeks. They talked about life, about their experiences, and about what it meant to truly be free. James found himself opening up in ways he never had before, sharing his frustrations, his fears, and his dreams with someone who didn't judge him. And Robert, in return, offered advice that challenged James's perspective on everything. But the real shift came when James decided to do something about it, to give back. He reached out to a local shelter for the homeless and began volunteering his time, offering not just money, but his attention, his presence. He learned about the systemic issues that led to homelessness, about the lack of opportunity, and about how people like Robert weren't failures. They were simply forgotten by a society that had more than enough to give. One day, James found Robert again, sitting outside a small park. He sat down beside him, and for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "You know," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think I've been living a lie. I thought success was all about the money and the status. But it's not. It's about what you give. It's about helping others find their way, just like you helped me." Robert smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "I didn't help you. I just showed you something you already knew. You just had to remember." And just like that, everything clicked for James. He had spent his life chasing after things that didn't matter, but now he understood the true meaning of success. It was about living with purpose, giving back, and making a difference in the lives of others. The journey that had begun with an unexpected encounter on his front steps had turned James's life upside down. He had found a new sense of purpose, one that didn't come from his father's wealth or his own status, but from a place of genuine compassion and understanding. James Kessler wasn't just a billionaire's son anymore. He was someone who understood what it meant to be human. The end of the story wasn't just a transformation for James. It was a call to action for anyone who watched, showing them that success isn't defined by what you have, but by what you give to others. And for James, that was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The day James found Robert outside his mansion had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully grasp. But as the days passed, his connection to Robert deepened. It was no longer just about his curiosity. It was about understanding the life that so many ignored. The more they spoke, the more James realized how far removed his own existence was from reality. One evening, about a month after their first encounter, James made his way back to the park where he had met Robert for the third time. He had come to expect the same quiet wisdom, the same gentle lessons. But today, things would be different. James had spent the past few weeks dedicating his time to Robert's cause, working at homeless shelters, speaking out against the inequalities he had once ignored. Robert, ever the guide, had continued to share the truth about what it meant to truly live a meaningful life. But the more James gave, the more his father, Marcus Kessler, began to notice. Marcus had been pleased with James's new volunteer work, at least on the surface. As a billionaire, he understood the importance of public perception. "It's good for your image, son," he had said. "It'll make you look like you care, like you're working hard to make a difference." But beneath his father's approval, James could feel the tension rising. Marcus didn't understand. This wasn't about appearances or reputations. This was about a real transformation, one that James was experiencing every single day. Tonight, James had arranged to meet Robert again at the park. But when he arrived, there was no sign of him. The bench where Robert usually sat was empty. James hesitated, feeling a slight panic rise in his chest. He had become so attached to the lessons, the insights Robert had provided, that the thought of losing him, the one person who had opened his eyes to the truth, was unbearable. James called Robert's phone, but there was no answer. His frustration began to mount. Why wasn't he answering? Was he sick? Or worse, was he in trouble again? He paced back and forth, his thoughts spiraling. A million questions and assumptions ran through his mind. Was this another one of those moments where Robert would disappear, only to return when James least expected it? Or was this a sign that Robert no longer wanted to talk to him? Suddenly, a figure appeared from the shadows. Robert walking toward him with a slight limp, his face more tired than usual. James's heart sank. He could tell something was off. Robert's usual composure was gone, replaced by a visible weariness. "Robert!" James rushed over, his voice filled with concern. "Where have you been?" "I've been trying to reach you." For the audience, the takeaway was clear. Everyone has the power to make a difference, no matter their circumstances. Whether it's through a donation, volunteering, or simply showing kindness to someone in need, each act contributes to a larger movement of positive change. Years later, Isabella returned to Bright Horizons for its anniversary celebration. The once dilapidated building was now a beacon of hope, bustling with activity and joy. She was greeted by children and staff alike, all eager to show her the impact of her work. Amelia, now a teenager, presented Isabella with a new painting, a vibrant depiction of the orphanage surrounded by smiling children. It was titled A New Horizon. Isabella couldn't hold back her tears as she hugged Amelia, overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment. As the celebration continued, Isabella reflected on how far they had all come. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were moments when she had doubted herself. But standing there, surrounded by the laughter and love of the children she had fought for, she knew it had all been worth it. The event ended with a speech from Mrs. Caldwell, who spoke of the orphanage's transformation and the power of one person's courage to inspire change. "Isabella taught us that it's not about what you have," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's about what you do with what you have. And she showed us that when we come together, we can create something extraordinary." The story of Isabella and Bright Horizons became a lasting legacy, inspiring countless others to follow in her footsteps. And as Isabella left the celebration, her heart full, she carried with her the profound knowledge that even the smallest act of kindness could create ripples of hope that would last a lifetime. Resolve. He opened the door, ready to face whatever came next. The climax had arrived. The world James thought he knew would never be the same again. In the aftermath of his confrontation with his father, James began the painstaking process of untangling the web of corruption Marcus had built. He worked tirelessly, reaching out to homeless shelters, community leaders, and advocates, determined to undo the damage his father had caused. Each day, James grew more confident in his newfound purpose. He had walked away from the life that was once everything to him, and now he was using his privilege to create real change. The true transformation came when James partnered with Robert, the homeless man who had once shown him the depth of his own ignorance. Robert's experiences became the driving force behind James's mission to fight homelessness and poverty. Together, they raised awareness, started programs, and worked on systemic change to provide affordable housing and resources for those in need. Months later, James stood at a podium in front of a crowd of supporters, including former homeless individuals, volunteers, and advocates. As he launched an initiative aimed at eradicating homelessness, he realized how far he had come. He was no longer the privileged heir to a fortune built on exploitation. He was a man committed to justice, to empathy, and to giving back. The moral of James's story is simple. Success isn't measured by wealth or status, but by how we use our resources to help others. True wealth is found in the kindness we show, the changes we create, and the lives we touch. James had learned that real fulfillment comes from living a life of purpose and service to others, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life.